All roads lead to power, and on this show we're going to break that idea down a little bit. What is power? Who has it? And how do you get it? I'm your host, Jeff Couillard. Welcome to the show.
It's a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Because the so-called real world of men and money and power hums merrily along on the fuel of fear and anger and frustration and craving and the worship of self. The really important kind of freedom involves attention and awareness and discipline.
If people don't learn power, people don't wake up. And if they don't wake up, they get left out.
Okay, welcome back to Powerful. My name is Jeff Couillard, and I'm really excited about today's episode, mostly because we're coming up to the end of 2020, and my commitment last year was to run the show for about a year and see how it went, and see if I enjoyed it, and if my guests enjoyed it, and so far, so good. And so we're going to keep the show rolling into the new year and keep the guests coming on. But tonight, I've got an episode that doesn't actually have a guest. It's just me tonight, and I wanted to talk about leadership. It's one of those things that I spend a lot of time thinking about. I do a lot of work in leadership development and coaching with leaders and teams kind of across sectors. A lot of time spent in the nonprofit sector, obviously working in addiction and mental health. That's my background. But also a lot of time in corporate environments and healthcare and education services and government. And so I've got a pretty broad perspective on leadership, and I see the challenges of leadership all over the place. And it's a tough gig being a leader, especially in today's day and age of complexity and very quickly changing circumstances and diversity and equity and inclusion. And there's just a ton on the average leader's plate that they have to balance and juggle and have to make decisions around. And so tonight I wanted to unpack for you what I see as what I call the 7 domains or 7 dimensions of leadership, to talk through some at high level, some of the things and the strategies and the things that I think are most important to leadership, and introduce you to maybe some concepts and tie some concepts together in a way that you probably haven't done before or hasn't been done for you. So leadership is the topic for tonight, and as always, I love it when there's questions, and so because it's a solo show, feel free to just fire it. If you're watching on Facebook Live, just fire into the comment box if you have any questions about anything that I'm talking about. So we're going to get things rolling with the very first dimension. And I'm going to do this in reverse order of how I actually see this. And that'll make sense as I'm going through it. But I'm going to start at the highest level and work my way down to what I consider to be the absolute foundation, the bedrock of good leadership practice, and which we'll get to tonight. So the show is going to be a little bit shorter, probably about half an hour tonight, unless we get a bunch of questions, in which case we'll just keep rolling. But thank you so much for joining me. And so the very first thing when I think about leadership at the highest level, leadership is about performance. Leadership is about getting some results and having some sort of impact. And so I call this the impact dimension. This is where, the ultimate accountability lies with the leadership to have an impact or get the results that they've been hired to get or put into a position of leadership to get. Leadership comes with it. The reason why it's leadership is because there's some sort of expectations around performance, right? Leaders are expected to get the results that either the company or the organization or the group of people wants, right? And so that's the highest level. And this is actually where this is what is usually the most visible, right? It's usually that we can see people's performance, or we can kind of gauge the results that they're getting, and either, compensate them for it or train them to get better results. But we're often talking about results in different kind of ways. Especially in the corporate sector, it's a little bit easier. I think in the nonprofit sector, we actually have a problem with the results, which we can talk about at some other point in time. But in an ideal world, be really, really clear that this is what good performance looks like for this team or this organization that you're in charge of as a leader. And we hold people accountable to that, and we measure those things. Underneath of that, in order to get high performance, in order to get the kind of impact that we're after as leaders, we have to take action, and our teams have to take action. Right? And so this next layer I call the action and accountability layer. So in order to get the impact, in order to have the impact and get the results we want, we need to have some sort of actually people doing things, right? We actually have to take action on things, and there has to be some level of accountability or some built-in accountability into leadership and into teams in order for people to take those actions. I know I need accountability. I was just having this conversation the other day with a good friend where it's like, I actually need that accountability to do like pretty basic things, like just to get off the couch and go for a run. Sometimes I need to make that commitment to somebody and be held accountable to it in relationship. And so lots of ways we can look at accountability, but it's an essential ingredient in great leadership is the willingness and the ability to take action on things, make decisions when you need to, and the accountability, some sort of accountability mechanism that goes along with that. Okay. But what I often see is that people, and I've been there myself, is that we just take action, and it's not actually meaningfully connected, or it's not meaningfully tied back to something that we've actually agreed to. And so this is where I think about leadership in a team context, where you've got a team of people that you're leading, and you're wanting to get certain results, and you want people to take the right actions on your team. And we get to this layer of this goal consensus or buy-in layer. Are people taking action based on something that they've agreed to, right? Do we have some sort of consensus around what are the actual goals here on the team? What are we trying to accomplish, right? And are we bought in on how we're going to get there? Right? Have we done any kind of team planning, right? Or is it a very top-down approach? And so most of us have probably experienced at some point in time some sort of top-down hierarchical approach to leadership where you've just been given tasks to do, or you've been given a process to follow. And probably you've either struggled with that, or you know people that have struggled in that environment because there hasn't been a process where you can actually buy in to the things that you're doing. You're just kind of being told this is why to do what, like how you need to do it, and you don't get the why underneath of it. And so if we want people to reliably take action and be motivated to take action and be willing to be held accountable to those actions, there has to be some sort of process, some sort of mechanism by which we can do goal consensus, where we can actually have robust conversations about what's meaningful to the team and how we want to get there. So some sort of planning and buy-in mechanism. Okay. In order to get to that point, right? So we're a couple layers deep now. We've got performance and results and impact at the top. We've got action and accountability is what gets us that impact. Then we have this goal consensus layer, where if we do a good job of this, then we're going to get good, reliable action. But underneath of that, underpinning that is what I call the vision layer, right? And this is really like alignment and prioritization, right? And so this maybe isn't even like big V vision, like that capital V vision that drags us forward into the future. This might be like, why are we doing this thing this month or this week or today, right? Some sort of mechanism to all be aligned on what the priority is for the team, right? I'll often do an exercise where I ask team members, just write down your top 3 priorities, right? And then we stick them up on the wall. And it's pretty surprising, and often not that surprising to me, but surprising to the team to see just a huge range of priorities. And then they wonder why they don't have good goal consensus, why they don't agree that this is where we should be putting our time and our energy and our resources. It's because we haven't done a good job of prioritizing and aligning as a team. And actually, a lot of my work these days right now as a consultant and coach and facilitator in different organizations is actually just to come in at this layer and just help teams practice prioritization. As simple as that might sound, it's actually more challenging than it might seem, right? Is to get an entire team to figure out that this is the shared priority or a couple of most important things and get really aligned on what that looks like. But if we can't do that, if we don't do that, then there's no way that we can get goal consensus. Because just thinking of my own experience, if I'm sitting at a table full of other people and we don't have this priority conversation, any goal, any planning that's done is bound to not include the things that are most meaningful to me or the people sitting beside me. And so we'll nod our head and we'll smile and we'll have what's called artificial harmony, which if you go back and listen to an episode with Kimberly McAdams from September, we talked about artificial harmony and how that shows up on teams. But if we don't do a good job of this, then we'll get that, and we won't get good goal consensus, and we won't get good planning as a result. So as you can see, we're starting to get a little bit deeper into the experience of teams and the experience of leadership. And this is the 7 domains of leadership. And the 5th domain, right, so this is number 4. The 5th domain, as we get a little bit deeper, is actually the trust layer, right? And we hear people talk about trust all the time. You can't open up LinkedIn. You can't find a good leadership book these days that doesn't have trust all over it, or psychological safety, or some version of that conversation happening. And I actually think that we've kind of missed the boat on it, or we were just a little bit off with how we think about trust, because we haven't asked ourselves, like, what's the point of trust? What's the point of psychological safety on our teams? We've kind of, a lot of people have this real, or think that that's an end in and of itself, is just to have a trusting relationship. And of course that's important. But what's important about building trust with a team is that you can actually have healthy conflict. So you can actually have what I call productive tension, right? Which is the ability to sit down in a room and disagree with each other, right? Or disagree about strategy, or say that's not the thing that's most important, right? When you go up a layer to that vision, alignment, and priority, if we don't have good trust and productive tension, we're never going to get a strong vision. We're never going to get strong alignment on a team. Okay, so this is actually a critical layer, and all roads kind of start pointing back to this. If we have performance issues in an organization, or if a leader's experiencing a lack of alignment, usually if we can follow that thread, it's going to tie right back to trust and productive tension. And this is unfortunately where a lot of models of leadership kind of start from, is they say you need to have trust, business moves at the speed of trust, psychological safety is the most important thing. And we haven't had the conversation about what builds psychological safety, what actually builds trust, because trust is an outcome of something, right? Trust is an expectation, right? Once we've built it, we expect that we can trust people and we'll be safe with them. So how do we get there? How do we get to trust? And so the sixth dimension of leadership is, I call it the connection layer. And that's really what it is. It's about meaningful connection to each other, not to a vision, not to a priority, not to some sort of outcome, but to each other as human beings, right? To each other in relationship, to each other with our shared values, right? And so this is the layer where values conversations get really important, and basic humanity, right? And so when we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think that that's as much a connection and belonging conversation as it is anything else, right? How do we connect meaningfully to each other and to the team that we're a part of? And there's a lot of things that get in the way of connection, right? And so sometimes when we actually go back up this chain a little bit and we get to the top rung and we start having performance conversations, if we don't have solid connection, those can be really scary conversations. And I've been a part of those conversations with leaders and their teams where it's really hard to talk about results and performance and impact if you're not strongly connected, right? Because the fear sets in, right? And we don't want to be truthful, or we don't want to be put on the spot. We like to hide. So there's a lot of hiding, on teams, of hiding from accountability, right? And it's because fundamentally we're not connected to each other and we don't feel safe in the environment. And so connection becomes the critical component of building trust, right? If we're connected, right? If we share values, if I know that you see me as a useful, valuable, significant person, right? And that I have meaning outside of anything else that we might do together, right? It's much more likely that I'm going to trust you and be able to engage in some sort of healthy conflict with you. Okay. And then underneath of all of this, so we're getting into the seventh dimension, the last domain of leadership, which is where I believe it all starts. And unfortunately, we don't have enough of these conversations. And so I would love to have this conversation with you. And I'm actually going to be doing a bit of a theme in the month of January and getting some stuff out into the world about power, because at the end of the day, when we think about connection and we think about disconnection as its opposite. So if what we're after is connection and what we don't want is disconnection to each other or to what's most meaningful or to our values, right? We want to live in alignment and congruence with each other. If we want that, we have to talk about power, and we have to talk about the right use of power, because it's wrong uses of power that drive disconnection, and it's right uses of power that drive connection. And so at the end of the day, I love getting leaders to a very binary spot, right? Where the thing we're about to do or the thing we're doing is either driving connection or we realize that it might drive disconnection, right? Because then we can get very choiceful about how we want to show up as leaders. And most leaders that I talk to, when I say, do you want to show up and use your power well with your team, or do you want to show up and use your power poorly with your team? Given those two options, I've never actually had a leader that says, actually, no, I'm here to use my power poorly, right? Everybody wants to use their power well. And then we start talking about like, well, what's not going well, right? And what are you doing that is having unintended consequences, right? Where is your impact misaligned with your intention, right? Because intention actually isn't good enough when it comes to right uses of power. And the right use of power is actually a framework that I was introduced to probably 6 or 7 years ago, working in addiction and mental health treatment. We had a therapist come and do some training with the team, and I attribute it to being as transformative as anything else that we did as a team over the dozen or so years that I worked in addiction and mental health, because it gave us a language and it gave us insight into the experience we were having with clients and simultaneously the experience we were having with other stakeholders who had power, and how power showed up in those relationships and the power dynamics that are actually quite predictable when we get into positions of power, when we have a relationship that has some sort of power dynamic. And every relationship has power dynamics, and we know that leadership is a power dynamic, right? It's built into the whole idea of leadership is power. So how we show up with our power, how we use our power matters, because it'll, like I said, it either drives connection or it drives disconnection. And I'm not going to dig too deeply into power tonight because, like I said, that's going to be my focus for the month of January. I'm going to have a few guests on the show. I think next week, actually, I've got a great guest. Dr. Amanda Aguilera is going to be on the show to talk about power from her perspective. And so we'll talk about that down the road. But in a nutshell, those are the 7 different dimensions, 7 different domains of leadership. And so it starts at the top with performance, results, or impact, what we're after, the thing we're trying to accomplish. We can only get there by actually taking action, right? We don't get results without some sort of action. And if we don't have accountability built in with the action, action might be a little bit hit and miss, right? Or might not be aligned very well. We have to have some sort of goal consensus. We have to have buy-in or some sort of planning process by which team members can actually come to the table. And so a lot of the work that I'm doing right now is around building what's called a self-organizing team, or agile teams. It's been pretty common in the software development industry for probably the last decade or two, and it's just starting to trickle out into more of the mainstream. But agile teams that work together to identify priorities and solve problems, as opposed to more of a cascading or waterfall approach where leaders decide what needs to happen and then they start to give orders down the chain. That model is not very responsive or adaptive to fast-changing environments, and let's face it, we live in a pretty fast-changing environment. So there's a lot of work to be done in this particular layer in most of our organizations. But none of that matters. We can't get to good goal consensus. We can't get to buy-in with our teams if we don't have good alignment around what our priorities are and some sort of vision. And like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be this like 10-year, 50-year, even 3-year vision. It has to be just clear. What are we working towards? And if we only have, because we're living in the middle of a COVID world, if we only have a clear picture of the next month, then let's just make sure that everybody's working from the same picture, that we're aligned on what that looks like and what the priorities are within that. Right? In order to have those good conversations, we have to have trust, and the point of having trust is to embrace tension and to use conflict to maximize the team's ability to be innovative. Right? That's really what like conflict and tension on a team is for here's our problem, how might we solve this, and to get everybody working towards it. Right? And if somebody's sitting there at the back of the room with a solution and they're not willing to say it because they don't feel safe, then the team is poorer for it and the organization is poorer for it. And so there's very practical reasons why we want to build trust and use that to embrace some tension. And like I said, I talked about connection being the underpinning of trust, right? And that's empathy, and that's discretion, and that's compassion, and that's some of those core emotional intelligence skills, right? That there's a lot of conversation about in leadership circles right now. And then the conversation I think we're missing the most, and the one that I'm really excited about, and hence why this podcast actually exists in the first place, is to talk about the right uses of power, to talk about power and what it is and why it matters so much and how it shows up in relationship, especially in leadership relationships where there's a level of responsibility. And that means if you're a parent, that means if you're a partner, that means if you are a leader or a manager or a boss in an organization, I want to have a conversation with you about how power shows up in that dynamic so that you can use it well. All right? Because like I said, no one wants to wake up and say, I wonder how I can misuse my power today. We all wake up wanting to use it really well. So that's the show tonight. And like I said, it's going to be a short one. We're 20 minutes in, so this will just be a little morsel that you can chew on between now and my next guest, which is, like I said, Dr. Amanda Aguilera, I believe, is queued up for next week. And thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful holiday season.